I'd like to start off by welcoming everyone here today. I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land where we are. In my case, it's the Ngunnawal people, and I extend this respect to all Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. So we're here today to discuss the work of Rebecca Blackburn. The talk is about can low consumption lifestyles help us meet our climate goals? Rebecca has a background in science writing and environmental science and is a first-year psychology PhD student. She's actually the inaugural recipient of our Game Change Scholarship, which has been set up by a group who called the Game Change Neighbours. Acknowledging that future generations will be living with the consequences of climate change, the group have formed to empower students to find answers and make decisions about optimal responses and actions. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank them for their contributions, particularly Ray Kiley, Anne-Marie and Graham Waters. So back to Rebecca. Her PhD examines the question, could low consumption lifestyles help us meet our climate goals? Rebecca's going to speak for about 20 minutes and then there'll be time for questions and discussion, and we'll wrap up at about 5:45. So just letting you know that we'll be recording the presentation, but not the discussion. So during the presentation, you can put your questions in the chat as you think of them, and then I'll invite you to ask them, or I can ask them on your behalf during the question time. And you can also raise your hand after the presentation and we'll go through and you can ask the questions directly of Rebecca. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks very much, Claire. Thank you very much to everyone who have come today. I'm delighted to be the inaugural Game Change Scholarship holder and very grateful to have received the scholarship. And today I'm going to be talking about low consumption lifestyles and their possibility to reduce consumption and potential climate change impacts. So the first part of the talk, I'm just going to give a brief overview of how I came to be doing this PhD. So it started many years ago, and I was an Australian volunteer abroad in the Cook Islands. So a volunteer abroad is a bit like Peace Corps, and you work as at local salary to in capacity building role. And my project was working on a recovery program for an endangered bird. So when I found out I had been offered this role, I started packing up my possessions, selling them, putting them in storage, and eventually I made my way to the airport with two backpacks of clothes, a couple of musical instruments, and a second-hand computer. In those days, laptops didn't even exist, I don't think. And we get to the counter, and the Qantas person takes one look and says, "You're not taking that on the plane." So we had to take it to check it in under the carriage. So I arrive in the Cooks, and it is absolutely beautiful island. It is everything you could imagine that a tropical island might be. It's colourful and it's warm, and there's bougainvillea and frangipanis. And we live in this house, the one on the left-hand side you can see, and our neighbours are on the right-hand side. It's just a simple sort of A-frame, one room on the bottom, two small rooms on the top. And you can see in the top corner three of the children who live next door. So there's family next door, there's 6 people who live there, and there's only 2 of us in our house. And there's no fence that divides the properties. There's no fences anywhere in the Cooks, and there's no letterbox numbers. It's all pretty low key. And these kids they don't normally wear these kind of clothes. They're specially dressed up because it's their brother's hair cutting ceremony. One day, the little girl wanders over to our house, and she just she looks around at the living room and she just says,
Range Rover. Two other men I'm travelling eastbound on the M4 near Croydon in Sydney.
Sorry, can I ask everybody to put their microphone on mute, please?
Information around.
I don't know what happened there, but I will repeat that. So she wanders into the room and she looks around the room and then she just goes, geez, you guys have lots of stuffs. And I thought, you should see our storage unit back home. But like most people from a wealthy country, I had a lot of stuff. And this was a thought, she seeded a thought that stayed with me for many years. While I was in the Cook Islands, I got interested in another idea, and that was, why do environmentalists not act environmentally? And I noticed one day that the head of the local environment group, she was down the shops and she had a plastic bag. And I thought, well, you know, why do I know all about the environment, but I don't know, why do I not always behave environmentally? And I realised that it was because there were so many things you could do and I didn't actually know what mattered. And this idea stayed with me. And when I came back to Australia, I ended up doing a master's. And for my master's thesis, my focus was, what are the priority actions for householders? How could they reduce their climate impact? And the outcome was food, transport, and energy. And though this was a couple of years ago, these three priority areas are still the priority actions that we need to take. And I ended up writing a book about it, which ended up being published by HarperCollins. But when I wrote this book, there was still a bit that part of me was like, well, the real deal is about consumption, but that's too difficult to address. So I ignored that. I didn't cover that in the book, but again, it sat with me for a while. And eventually I decided I wanted to find out what we could do about it. And so I came to ANU to do a PhD. So consumption is the major driver of climate change. It's the underlying problem. And I'm sure it's, which is of course currently in the news right now. But the question is who's responsible? Is it government? Is it industry? Is it business or individuals? This week, there was an article in The Guardian and it featured the Atlassian co-founder, Mike Cannon-Brookes. And he pointed out that we're all responsible, and that's something that I fundamentally agree with. And he highlighted two key areas. One was housing, one was cars. So with housing, we have very low energy standards in Australia. And whose fault is it? Well, I think the government needs to put its foot down and do something about it. But then you could say industry and developers and builders, they need to accept the new standards and the old standards, some of them don't, and they need to be educated, they need to promote these standards and encourage the people who buy their homes to go for the highest quality standards. And then we've got the individuals, and the individuals, oh, and I forgot one more, the real estate agents. So the real estate agents need to promote sustainable homes and sell it to their customers. And then you get the individuals, and the individuals need to ask for that, and they need to ask the builders when they renovate, I want an energy efficient house, and they need to ask the real estate agents when they're buying or renting, can I have an energy efficient home? And the same goes with cars. So we have Australia is now labelled the dumping ground of the world's worst cars. Why? Because we have a policy vacuum. So that's government. But then we also have the car manufacturers who are importing cars, and some of them are bringing in their entire stock of electric vehicles, but some of them are not. So they need to bring them in. And then we have individuals who need to go, well, for my next car, I'm gonna try out this new fangled technology and see what it does. So I think what Mike said is really sums up that we're all responsible, and that's why I'm focusing on individuals for this for my PhD. And I read a journal article by Weidman et al, and I've summarised it, and basically he said we might not be able to control what things are produced or how they're made, but we do have control over one decision, and that is what we buy. So consumption's a problem. This is a photo by a person called Menzel, and he produced a book, a photo essay called Material World. It's quite a few years old now, but the point is still valid. And what he did is he got people from around the world to put all their possessions in front of their house, and then he photographed them. And this is the one from America, and it wouldn't be any different if it was Australia. And you can see they have a ton of stuff. Here's another example. A group of researchers in the US studied 32 families in San Francisco. And it was an anthropological survey, and they did thousands of hours of video footage, photographs, and they examined the material life of these families in immense detail. And this is an example of one of the garages. And they found that 75% of the families in this study could not use their garage because it was full of other things. And this is an example of toys. So this child had over 250 dolls, which is quite amazing. American children represent 3% of the world's population, yet they purchase 40% of the world's toys. And this is a picture of a study. So they counted the objects that they could see. So this was only the visible objects. They didn't open cupboard doors or look under things. And it doesn't include paper. So they found that the number of objects in in studies range between 21 and 2,337 items. I think this one must have been at the 2000 end. So we do have a problem with stuff, but the challenge is how do we motivate change? In environmental psychology, there's been a fair bit of work on attitudes. So the idea is if we change people's attitudes, we change their behaviour. But they've now found that there isn't a very strong relationship between attitudes. An example was a study by run by a guy called Peter Newton in 2013. And he surveyed about 1,000 people in Melbourne. And he grouped the people into 4 categories: very green, moderately green, mildly green, not green. And then he asked them, what's your energy consumption? What's your water consumption? And was there a correlation? No. Well, basically, there was no difference between people's attitudes and their actual consumption. That study shocked me so much that I actually ran home and checked out my own consumption, because I was like, oh my goodness, I hope I'm not like that. But I guess what it points to, though, is that it is difficult. Even if we believe we need to change our behaviour, it's not necessarily easy. So I thought what we could do is maybe let's look at people who have changed their behaviour, but for a very different reason. And that is minimalists. So minimalism is an idea that's been around for the last 10 years. And it's about people reducing the number of material possessions they own. I think what's key is it's not necessarily, I mean, there's some in the media, people who reduce their possessions to very tiny amounts got a lot of coverage, but it's not about reducing it to 30 items or whatever, but it's more about what's the Goldilocks zone? You know, do we need $250? Maybe not. Maybe we need a couple of dolls. And that's what it's about. So there's there was a study that came out this year, and they analysed what is minimalism, and they defined it as consisting of three things. It's owning limited number of possessions and intentionally choosing what to acquire and keep, and a sparse, uncluttered aesthetic. So why should I research minimalism? Well, minimalists don't appear to practice minimalism for environmental reasons. And I think that's kind of interesting, because they're not doing it for some altruistic reason. They're doing it for some other reason. And I think that could be the key. There's also the potential environmental benefit. If they reduce their number of possessions, you would think in theory their environmental impact must be lower. It hasn't been measured yet, but that's what we would expect. And then there's the potential psychological benefit. So we know that materialism, which is the pursuit of status, fame, and wealth, is really bad for your well-being. And there's a strong link between consumption and materialism. So it's possible that minimalists are the opposite of materialists and therefore have good well-being. There's also clutter has lots of negative impacts. It's known to have lower well-being. Another study found that university students who had cluttered rooms were more likely to procrastinate. That's another reason to procrastinate, isn't it? Tidy up your room. The study I mentioned earlier, the 32 families, they analysed they asked the women in the families, they asked everyone actually, what did they think about the clutter in their homes and how they felt about it. So the women who felt that they had a lot of clutter had increased cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and they had lower mood. Interestingly, men didn't seem to be affected by the clutter. And then in kindergartens, they found that cluttered kindergartens tended to affect children's attention. Sorry, I just bumped my key. Yeah, okay. So there's a real chance that reducing consumption could provide a double dividend, environmental and well-being benefits. So for my research, I'm going to be looking at, do minimalists have a lower footprint than the general population? Do minimalists have greater well-being? Is minimalism the opposite to materialism? What motivates minimalists to pursue this lifestyle? And could minimalists motivate or inspire others via social norms? So I did a literature review of low consumption lifestyles, and I came up with 4. The first one is voluntary simplicity, which people may be familiar with. It's the most well studied, and it's been around since the 70s. And people who pursue voluntary simplicity tend to pursue it for spiritual, environmental, self-sufficiency reasons, as well as reducing consumption. I guess you could say there's perhaps a bit of a hippie bent to them. Then there's frugalism, which is pleasure in saving. And then there's tightwaddism. Isn't that an awesome word? I think it's American. And that is, they're people who feel pain when they spend. And minimalism, which I've already discussed. And I think political or environmental motivation is unlikely, but this has not been studied. And I've included green consumption in this list, but it's not they're not low consumption. because they still consume, but they spend money on greener products. But the research has found that green consumption does not lower your footprint. So I'll leave that one for the moment. So here's a summary of what the research says. Voluntary simplicity and wellbeing, environmental impact. So you can see with voluntary simplicity, the plus means positive, so i.e. low environmental impact and high wellbeing. And the minus means high environmental impact and question mark, we don't know. So under voluntary simplicity, there's a number of studies that say, yes, there's greater wellbeing. Under environmental impact, we've got a bit of a mixed message. So there's been 3 studies, all using different methods, eco footprint, life cycle analysis, and carbon footprint. And 2 of them say, yes, it has a lower footprint, and 1 of them says no. With type whatism, we don't know about wellbeing as far as I'm aware, but it appears to have a lower environmental impact. Frugalism, we don't know about wellbeing, but it doesn't appear to have a lower environmental impact. And minimalism, there's a little bit of research on wellbeing. So there was a 12-person study, which is called a qualitative study, and they found that it did improve wellbeing. And then there was another study which used a definition of minimalism, which I don't think is correct, but that study found wellbeing to be higher for minimalism. And then under environmental impact, we don't know. So there's lots to work on. We're getting mixed messages. We don't really know which lifestyle has the lower environmental impact. We don't know we're not sure who's got greater wellbeing. And we don't know that much about motivations. So that's what I'm next going to be working on, is doing some surveys to identify these things. And that brings me to the end of my talk. So thank you very much for patiently listening. I noticed there's a couple of questions in chat, which I guess Claire will highlight after this. And I also specifically wanted to thank the Game Change Enablers who have given me this scholarship, and the Institute of Climate Change, Energy and Disaster Solutions, and also the Department of Psychology, and my supervisors, specifically Professor Ian Walker, Dr. Zoe Leviston and Dr. Ashley Schramm.